and welcome to another Camp Blanding Museum video on the history of Camp Blanding. I'm Dr. George Cressman, and today we're going to chat a little bit about the World War II static displays. We're going to start here with thinking about looking at the C-47. The C-47 was patterned after the McDonnell Douglas DC-3, and it became the military version that was used extensively throughout the war. Over 10,000 C-47s were produced during the war. For the U.S., this was called the Skytrain, and the British version was called the Dakota. There was also a Navy version called the R-4D. The C-47 Skytrain, close to the DC-3, but it was modified slightly with a strengthened floor, with an astrodome for navigation purposes on the roof of the aircraft, and with a shortened tail section to allow towing of gliders. In the cargo version, there was a hoist installed, but that hoist was taken off for paratrooper operations. The C-47 Skytrain, or Dakota as the British called it, was used in all of the theaters. In the Pacific Theater, it was used very much for resupply operations. And it was most famously known in the Pacific Theater for flying the hump, flying over the Himalayas between India and China to resupply troops in China. In the Mediterranean and European theaters, it was used very often for paratrooper operations. And there were drops, parachute drops in Sicily, Italy, in the Normandy invasion, Market Garden in the Netherlands, and then the final airdrop of the European theater, Operation Varsity, to jump across the Rhine. So here on the side of our C-47, the port side of the aircraft, notice this particular C-47 has been modified for paratrooper operation. The hoist has been removed from this one, and you simply have the exit door, entry and exit door that paratroopers would use. One of the more interesting uses for the C-47 was for evacuation of seriously wounded. And it was done in two ways. One, there was a load of wounded placed inside the aircraft itself, and this was the pioneering effort to develop nurses, air evacuation nurses. Another method was to tow gliders that were filled with wounded, and this was done particularly in the Remagen bridgehead near the end of the war. I'm standing now in front of the museum's M4 Sherman Tank. The M4 Sherman Tank was the most widely used medium tank used by the Allies throughout World War II. There were 49,000 of these Sherman tanks produced during the war. The manufacturers consisted of a number of companies who had made their living before the war producing locomotives for railroad operation. And a large number of these Sherman tanks also went through the Lend-Lease operations so that the Allies, the British, Australian, and Soviets all had versions of the M4 Sherman. The Sherman tank, as it was initially designed and introduced in North Africa in U.S. use during World War II, had a 75mm gun. And at that point, the Sherman's armor and gun outclassed all of the German tanks that were then in service. And as a consequence, there was very little modification done to this tank through the rest of the European War. And the Germans, however, were rapidly modifying their tanks, and so by the time we got to the Normandy invasion, the Sherman is still a usable tank, but it's not as good as the German tanks that were encountered then in the European theater. There were some modifications done during the war. Some of the Shermans were upgunned to a 76mm gun, and the British produced a version that was called the Firefly that had a 17-pounder gun. Nevertheless, what saved the Allies with this tank was the vast numbers that were produced during the war. And because the Allies had great air superiority during the war, they were able to overcome the armor and gun inadequacies of the later Sherman tanks. Well, I'm standing now in the museum's duck, the DUKW, or as the GIs preferred to call it, the DUCK duck. This vehicle was invented, designed by some engineers from General Motors. The name DUKW, or duck, comes from General Motors terminology. The D stands for the year it was designed, 1942. The U stands for utility. K stands for all-wheel drive. And the W stands for duplex dual tandem rear axles. This vehicle was an amphibious vehicle. It could be used to go out to ships, unload cargo from ships, and then carry it into the shore. And on shore, it was able to then convert to a land-based drive vehicle. It was designed to provide initially resupply operations, but then it wound up carrying troops also. The duck could carry up to 5,000 pounds of cargo, or could carry 24 troops. There were 21,147 ducks built between 1942 and 1945. 2,000 of them went to the British and Lend-Lease, 535 to the Australians, and 586 were sent on to the Soviet Union. There were some really interesting technical features of this vehicle. And one was that the driver could adjust the air pressure in his tires sitting from the driver's seat. So as he came on shore, if the roads were fairly solid, he could increase the tire pressure. If it was primarily sand, then the driver could reduce the air pressure to allow easier travel. Well, there you have just a brief introduction to the static displays in our World War II section. As you walk the museum, come out and visit the static displays. You'll find cargo trucks, artillery pieces, an ambulance, a number of half-tracks. We invite you to come out and visit with us, see the museum, and then walk the static displays here on the World War II side and across the street at our more modern section. Come see us. We're open every day from noon to 4. And for the museum and all of our terrific volunteers, this is Dr. George Cressman signing off.